here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. 50 years ago to this day, then U.S. Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Henry Kissinger, went on a secret mission to Beijing. The visit helped lay the groundwork for U.S. President Richard Nixon's historic trip to China and the eventual normalization of relations between the two countries. Today, 50 years later, we take a look back to help answer big questions on the direction of bilateral relations. Hopefully, here's a walk down of the memory lane.
At the height of the Cold War, China and the U.S. had both been testing the waters with each other, and it eventually led to Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China. A historic moment came on July 8, 1971, when Kissinger was visiting Pakistan and staged a show of suddenly falling ill from the heat and got on a plane to Beijing. Kissinger met with Chinese Premier Zhao and Lai. They would have 6 sessions.
Because we knew that the normalization of relations between China and the United States was essential for the peace of the world.
A week after Kissinger's visit, then U.S. President Richard Nixon announced his decision to visit China the year after, which surprised many.
We must recognize that the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States have had great differences. We will have differences in the future. But what we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war.
Mr. Nixon's one-week trip to China in 1972 was the first for any U.S. president and marked the start in normalizing relations between the two rivals, breaking a silence that lasted 25 years. As it said, this was the week that changed the world. 50 years later, bilateral relations have fallen to a new low under the post-Trump administration and now stand at another critical juncture. With the new administration in office, perhaps it's more reason than ever to draw lessons from the past.
For more on China and the United States 50 years ago and 50 years now, joining us in LA, Douglas Paul, a distinguished fellow of the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. What a pleasure to see you, sir. In Shanghai, Shending Li, a professor at the Institute of International Studies of Fudan University. Good to see you, Professor. Both of you witnessed history, shall I put it that way, and also you were also instrumental in your own ways of putting and helping with the bilateral relations. Let me start by asking both of you with a blunt question. Is it still relevant what happened 50 years ago today? Mr. Paul?
Well, yes, of course it is, because we had no relationship back 50 years ago. But the character of the relationship has certainly gone through dramatic change in the last 10 years, not to say 50 years.
Professor Shen?
First of all, I'm so glad to work with Doug today. And I think the spirit of Dr. Kissinger's move on China-US relationship still matters, because we still face common enemies, terrorism, climate change, a proliferation of WMD. And in the past, Soviet hegemonism, now we have a new threat. How to work together to beat this threat? We still need to use what Dr. Henry Kissinger used to work. So I think it's relevant.
You know, we were watching that beautiful wrap-up made by my colleagues of those historic moments, you know, all the sound bites of the old times 50 years ago. Today, they even sound relevant. It's amazing, isn't it? Mr. Paul, talking about having differences without having to be enemies with one another, that word can be put into today's situation anytime you talk about China and the United States. Tell me more about it.
Well, I think it captured the times. The U.S. and China were preoccupied, the U.S. with Vietnam and the Soviet Union, China with the Soviet Union and getting its own economy going. And so there was a meeting of minds that had been elusive prior to the Nixon Kissinger outreach to Beijing and China's receptivity to that. The business of sound bites, though, was possible in those days because we have substantial relations, and things had to be captured in the words of leaders. Today, going fast forward, it's harder to find the right words to embrace a whole range of substantive interactions, military, things that Ding Li just mentioned in terms of international cooperation, rivalries in the region. You can't do it in a few words. The new Biden administration has tried to say they will compete where they can, contest where they must, and cooperate where possible. That's the kind of phraseology that doesn't tell you very much. It's almost a sign that we don't take seriously those substantive relations that still need practical day-to-day work by our diplomats and our respective national security apparatuses.
Mr. Paul, when you say there are much more areas between the two countries that they have a common interest, that's very true. And that also coincides with the words shared by Vice President Wang Qishan earlier in a meeting marking the 50th anniversary of the secret visit of Dr. Henry Kissinger. Professor Shen, I want to go to you about that. Mr. Wang did talk about the expanded areas of cooperation, but he also talked about respecting three things: sovereignty, security, development interest between the two sides. How should we interpret that?
Well, I think when China-U.S. got normalization of their relationship in official way, both agreed that the U.S. will not continue its official relationship with Taiwan. It can keep some unofficial bond. And also it will relinquish its military relationship with Taiwan, no defense of Taiwan, and also U.S. military would withdraw completely from Taiwan. But the now situation looks more complicated. On the one hand, Mr. Campbell still commits to not to agree, not to support Taiwan independence. But the U.S. Secretary of Health, Mr. Azar, visited Taiwan officially last year. This is official relationship. And the U.S. Marine officially has been to Taiwan to train Taiwan's Marine. This is a military official bond. And also, U.S. has made Taiwan Relation Act and a few other official legal instruments committing to defend Taiwan. This deviates from U.S. earlier benign commitment. But at the same time, relationship in cultural, in sports, in medical, in various areas are expanding.
Let's talk about the Taiwan issue first. Rather than bring everything together, let's just talk about Taiwan. Dr. Henry Kissinger, he also made a speech, believe it or not, 98-year-old already, amazing. Talking about what made it happen 50 years ago. He said one thing that is very crucial, that the U.S. recognized Taiwan is part of China and there's only one China. Now, we all know there is some kind of ambiguity as a result of that historic time when the two sides really saw the interest of sharing a diplomatic relations. But that is one of the most crucial bottom line of this relationship. Mr. Paul, the younger generation, do they really respect the bottom line? And, trying to break the bottom line, have they ever thought about the consequences?
Well, I wouldn't want to overly generalize about the younger generation. I think there are differences of views.
Yeah.
I think we've seen more of the younger generation today than was the case a few years ago, arguing that the U.S. should become more unambiguous in its relationship with Taiwan. Interestingly, we had the Trump administration, not all of it, but part of it, including Mr. Pompeo and others, tried to push that line beyond what would probably be born over time in U.S.-China relations, given the understandings that were reached back in 1972 and 1982 and 79. And so the Biden administration has been trying to find a way to create guardrails on the relationship with Taiwan. They want to set them wider apart so that more interaction can take place on, say, medical or economic or other issues. but not really violate the pledges made in the earlier 3 communiques and related documents. And they've been sketching in the lines of this policy a little bit, but it hasn't been very, very clear. This week, the Czar for Asia, Kurt Campbell, said something about not supporting Taiwan independence, which is one more part of the sketch of what the relationship will be. But we're still not at the point where we know clearly what the new administration's policy is going to be.
Right.
And under those circumstances, you can understand why Mr. Wang Qishan might want to reiterate the importance of honoring the pledges on issues of sensitivity and sovereignty to China.
Right. He talked about the 3 joint communiques, how crucial they are for laying the foundation of this bilateral relations. Mr. Shen.
Yes. China is not committed to resolving the Taiwan issue immediately. But the U.S. should not push the envelope. Why committing to three communique on the paper, but also with this action, U.S. is deviating from its earlier, more clear and cooperative stance. And as you have said, U.S. need to be clear at a time when China is more competent, whether it is necessary to bring China-U.S. relationship to a more precarious situation. I think President Biden needs to be more serious in understanding the seriousness of U.S. current policy regarding Taiwan.
Now, there are a lot of things going on between the 2 countries. One of those things is ideology. The other of the things is national security. We heard those words often in both sides' comments. But how should we understand their each interpretations of these 2 issues? And whether these 2 issues will be used by some to diminish the real achievements of the bilateral relations. That's to many who do still care about these relations have a lot of thoughts about. I'm sure, Mr. Paul, you have also give thoughts about them as well. National security, let's just start with that.
Well, the Chinese authoritative documents and speeches in recent years have talked about a previously unseen 100 years of change taking place in the world, which are altering the characteristics of what constitutes national security. Where in the 1980s, the US and China got close to resist Soviet pressure. In the 1990s, China took a lower posture and focused on its own development. And the US in the post-2008-9 period has been similarly focused domestically and preoccupied in the Middle East. And now we're entering a new phase, and both sides are starting to articulate what they think national security is going to look like, where we have much more equal competitors in capacity, economic capacity, and military might between the US and China. So we're going through a redefinition of what will provide us the basis of stability on the front of national security.
Professor Shen, we did see both sides were trying to put the word like national security on the very top of their priorities in terms of the goals of development. China, for example, putting security and development together as the most important task. U.S. has been describing it in a different way under their political circumstances. How should we understand China's version of the so-called national security, and how is that relevant now, do you think, in this bilateral relations?
Well, on the Chinese side, I think my government views the national integrity is one of the major factors of national security. It is the U.S. and only the U.S., the only external factor that has openly challenged China's legitimate national security objective. Because U.S. is sending weapons to Taiwan, U.S. Marine is training Taiwan's Marine on Taiwan's island. And this is totally unacceptable. Even at the time when China-U.S. normalized their relationship in 1979, U.S. commits not to allow this to happen, not to allow U.S. armed force to be returned to Taiwan. And the U.S. commit to reduce arms sale to Taiwan in terms of quality and quantity over time. And now, 42 years later, and China does not see the U.S. is implementing its commitment, and the U.S. is acting actually in a reversed way. But at the same time, I think American considers that China is doing something in South China Sea that in U.S. interpretation may not be accordance of what China has accepted the rule of UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this, in the U.S. view, may have constituted China's not to accept as a legal responsibility under UNCLOS. So I think China-U.S. need to continue the spirit of Dr. Kissinger. Despite our huge difference, we need to meet, talk, rather than to keep a distance.
Okay.
To meet may not resolve our difficulty, but not to meet and refuse to meet may increase our misunderstanding.
Mr. Paul, to meet or not to meet, that will be discussed in many occasions on any issue between China and the United States. But Mr. Paul, what about the security issue, national security? You heard that so much, both in trade wars and now in many areas of China-U.S. relations. U.S. interpretation?
Well, the U.S., a variety of views, but we have a growing consensus in the Congress and in Washington that China has taken advantage of economic opportunities to enhance its national security capabilities, and that the U.S. needs to distinguish those things that we do with China to keep us from further strengthening China's capacity to resist U.S. or allied power in the region and in the world. This is the very beginning of the process. I don't know how it's going to end up because we have contending commercial and other interests. And the Biden administration, for tactical reasons, is very slow to articulate what it wants to achieve. So I think it's going to be some months before we finally have a leadership meeting between Mr. Xi and Mr. Biden, where I think some of these lines can be drawn more clearly.
All right.
Again, that's probably not going to be at the end of October, early November.
My last question, we only have 1.5 minutes left for all of us for this discussion. Now, the imagined enemy, sometimes it's needed in terms of rallying the crowd back at home. But in the mid and long term, whether it is a helpful thing or mislead the country to a place of no return, that is the ultimate question we also need to ask today. Mr. Paul, your thoughts on the U.S. situation. And Mr. Shen, I'm going to ask you about China's situation, how you see the U.S. as well.
Well, it's been a truism in American politics that the outside parties, in this case now the Republican outsiders, will always prod the incumbent authorities to be more bold. And the incumbent authorities, because they have to be responsible, can't be as bold as the attacks. So that's just part of our political process. I think the American people, at this point, have not been exposed to the downside as well as the upside of framing every issue as a competition with China. And over time, that probably will ameliorate if the U.S. and Chinese leaderships can prevent the competition from escalating more concretely.
Professor Shen, I'm afraid you have only 30 seconds left.
It's not unnatural to imagine an enemy, but it's important to play leadership role to turn an imagined enemy to be a real friend, a collaborator. And that tests wisdom, statecraft, and leadership. I do think Mr. Biden and my president, Mr. Xi Jinping, are able to do this. Right. Cooperate wherever they can, and don't be scared of competition, but constructive competition, not harmful competition.
Shending Li, Douglas Paul, what a pleasure, gentlemen, to see and hear from both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.